Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Oh my gosh, don't I always talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5e? Well, today's topic is high-level characters in Dungeons & Dragons 5e. Now, for anybody who's played previous versions of Dungeons & Dragons, they will know that high-level play is very exciting. For players, you get access to so many incredible aspects, spells, abilities, powers, whatever you want to call them. So it's very exciting. And I can totally understand your view behind that because playing at a high level with a character sounds like a lot of fun. So what I thought I would do for today to make a sort of a change from what I tend to do is rather than talk about things from the perspective that you've usually heard before, I would actually talk from the perspective of, do you really want to know what it's like to play a high level character and play, say, a level 20 PC or player character? Would you like to know what tends to happen and the sort of things you as a player might want to implement or be ready to expect? And that is really the focus for today. There will be a few things that are useful for Dungeon Masters as I go through this, but really I am talking primarily about things that will be useful for you as a player so you understand what's likely to take place when you're playing the game. And at the very end of the presentation, I'm going to sort of drop my big bombshells, you might say, to give you a really good idea of what's going on in terms of your high-level games and your high-level characters. So the very first thing you'll tend to find is this is your opportunity to roll like a bucket load of dice for damage. And not just damage. If you're playing a fighter, it's quite possible to have anywhere from 4 to 5 attacks in one turn. So that's 4 or 5 d20s to roll, plus all the damage dice. And if you're playing a fighter and you use action surge, you can have up to 10 attacks taking place at high level. Now that sounds like a wonderful thing to have, and I totally get it. But what a lot of my players would do is they would go out and they would buy like 4 or 5 different sets of dice to contend with this, because you just can't roll them one at a time. You've got to roll them all at the same time. Otherwise, you're going to be there a long time. Even they will get frustrated. So a lot of my players would literally have little, I wouldn't say a bucket, but like a mug and separate dice, and they would all be laid out in front of them, ready to go. So when their turn came through, and it was, right, it's your turn, Bob, Jill, whoever it was, they would just grab the dice, they're ready to go, and they'd roll the whole lot into, often they would have a dice tray. I found that a lot of high-level characters, the players would bring along dice trays, and these are often portable, things that you can sort of fold up and then fold away or fold out when you need to use them. Really clever idea. And they usually had like a lot of dice because they were going to be rolling a lot of dice, not just for attacks, but also for damage. And even with your spellcasters, a lot of your spells, something like Fireball or Lightning Bolt, and even some of the other spells, you're rolling like 8 6-sided dice, and if you cast it at a higher level, you're rolling even more dice. So the number of dice you roll is certainly increased. It's your opportunity to cause stupid amounts of damage. I can't count the number of times that players would roll their damage dice. Now I'm talking about your paladins, your rogue. There are other characters. Quite often I would find that the players had multi-classed, and so they were dipping into different classes. When you have something like a paladin mixed with a rogue, it is a frightening concept, and if you can do it well, great for you. But yes, in excess of 100 hit points worth of damage with a single blow or during a single turn. These are the sorts of things are possible at high level. And if you're looking forward to that, make sure you bring enough dice along to deal with something like that. Because often the fact that you're doing so much dice is not a result of tacking on Great Weapon Master and bumping up your static damage modifier. It's because you're just rolling so many dice all at once. And this will tend to happen when you start rolling criticals, but it can also happen or get very close to the 100 factor even when you don't roll a critical. So pretty exciting stuff, yes. Okay, so what about, essentially you're going to be playing an invincible superhero, and I think this is what a lot of players really like. The idea that, because at low level your character does feel like it can get knocked down. You're not necessarily going to get killed outright at level 1 or 2 or even level 3 with Dungeons and Dragons 5e, but certainly the chance of you going down or being killed outright is almost impossible to achieve. You know, there's really nothing that a dungeon master has in terms of damage output that can outright instantly kill a high level character. So you are essentially invincible unless you're in the wrong type of environment. So if you're like on the fire plane, or if you're underwater, things like that, that can cause problems because of ongoing damage when you're unconscious, if you wind up falling unconscious, which is very easy to do if you are already drowning and have gone all the way down to 0 hit points, and you're now suffocating essentially because you can't hold your breath anymore. So those sort of things can come up, and my advice to you is you don't necessarily need to concern yourself quite so much with spells and even magic potions and so forth that will increase your hit points, because even when you drop to like 0 hit points, the chances are there really isn't enough damage output coming through to instantly kill your character anyway. It can happen occasionally, but it's very rare. You're going to get to cast spells that change the very nature of reality and time. And my players, when they were playing the game, they would use spells like Wish and a lot of the divine spells, divination spells, and change the very nature and fabric of their world. Polymorph is a good example. You're really changing the nature of reality with something like polymorph, true polymorph. So when you start making bad decisions and you're worried about the consequences of those, it's actually possible at high level to actually change the outcome. So if the outcome was failure and you didn't succeed at your quest for whatever reason, you can actually use spells to change that outcome. By my players would often travel in time. On one occasion they made such a mess of the campaign, they used the Wish spell and went back in time to repair the damage they had done initially. They got really greedy, and I think somebody decided that they should try and find out what actually happens if you stick multiple bags of holding inside each other and see what happens. Well, bad things will happen, because that's what that the world came to an end essentially. They had like 14 bags of holding. They decided to stick all of them together at the same time, and I think it was 2 or 3 of them who did that. So some pretty crazy stuff. Your character's turn is going to take about 5 times as long. You know, when you were playing at low level, you had your turn, so forth. Even if you're very experienced, just because of the sheer amount of mathematics involved, the number of dice you're rolling, the types of spells and class features, the number of attacks you have, you're going to take about 5 times as long, unless you're really, really onto it. But I found that about 5 times as long is about right. Now this is awesome stuff. The only problem is that other people at the table are going to get to have a turn, and they're going to be taking probably just as long, if not longer. So yes, you're going to get a much longer turn in terms of combat. Only you can make the old gods look like a bunch of sissies. This is the sort of the point where you start battling gods, not, you know, some sort of villain or monster or creature. I mean, most of the monsters and creatures in the monster manual for Dungeons and Dragons 5e, at a certain point, you can deal with pretty much all of them, unless of course you have a dungeon master who's very, very cunning and clever, and they have used really good tactics, set up their environment just right, and they have also utilized things like minions or other effects. Maybe they've incorporated a trap or a timer of some kind, so you have to also achieve a particular goal, whether that's flip a lever or something like that. But essentially your character's moving into godhood. That means that there's going to be, you're going to have to make space, right? Essentially at some point when your character retires, you are probably going to wind up being classified as one of the gods, or at least a demigod of some kind. And of course, if you've got a dungeon master who doesn't feel that your character's like godlike, because they certainly will seem like it later on, then you are definitely right up there in the legendary section of heroes, a legendary hero at high level play. Okay, so when it comes to really sort of mixing things up, there's nothing the dungeon master can throw at you that has a chance anymore. I found that without a dungeon master making serious modifications to the game, there's really nothing much in terms of combat that can surprise you. The only thing they can really do at high level is present you with exploration and social interactions. Social interactions are the Achilles heel for high level play, because they're very much based on what you as a player say and do. It's not going to just be down to a dice roll in most cases, unless you have a dungeon master who's quite happy to just determine all social interactions by a single dice roll or a series of dice rolls, and you've got a really high modifier or something like that. But often that's not the case. A lot of the NPCs, villains, will have ulterior motives, and you'll have to figure out what their motive is. And you might find that no matter how you approach an NPC, the outcome is always bad for you, so you really can't necessarily trust anything that they say, particularly if you know they are the villain. So trickery, deception, they tend to be more difficult compared to something like combat, because as you'll notice, when you look at your character and the character progression, most of the things you get as you level up are very much focused on combat rather than anything else. So that means that you wind up becoming very strong at combat but weaker at the other aspects, and the other aspects of the game are more tied to how you play the game rather than the mechanical aspects of your character. So those are the things that a dungeon master will tend to start relying on, because they really can't test you with combat anymore, because there's nothing they can really throw at you. Things like divination spells can be used to predict the future, spy on enemies, and you'll find that you'll have to be very careful when you're using those spells. Usually they come off no problem the first time round, and then your dungeon master will start to get a little bit more cunning and coy and read the spell a bit more and start to change the aspect. They might be more cryptic. I know that as a dungeon master myself, I was more cryptic. I watched other dungeon masters provide rather cryptic descriptions of what might take place when divination spells were used. And then of course divination spells can be used against you. So once you start using them, your dungeon master will probably start pulling them out as well, and having your villains used something like scry and spying on you, or predicting events and so forth. And I mean, you can look at that as, oh well, that's countering what I'm doing, and that's metagaming, and it might well be to a certain degree, but often too you're just dealing with enemies and villains that are close to or just as powerful or more powerful than you are, and they're using those spells in that way for a very good reason. One of the things that really untangles a game, and you're going to get access to greater invisibility if you're a spellcaster and it's on your spellcasting list. Greater invisibility gives you an amazing advantage when it comes to making attacks. It doesn't give away your position in terms of making you visible. You don't become visible. They'll know where the attack came from, but then of course you do the normal, I'm going to make my attack while I've got greater invisibility on me. I'm going to move, okay, and I'm still invisible, so now they have to rely on other aspects of perception, such as listening to you, so hearing, or something like scent, if your dungeon master's using scent, smells, stuff like that. Maybe it might even be, they're dealing with a monster that doesn't rely on vision to actually detect you, so they're dealing with creatures that use tremor sense or true sight or blind sight, so that sort of changes things again. But greater invisibility, I know, is hugely useful. When you get it, use it, because I found it very, very useful myself. It will frustrate and confuse the dungeon master and it makes it really difficult for a dungeon master to track as well, particularly if there's multiple players in your group who are all using greater invisibility at the same time. This doesn't happen very often unless people have multi-classed, but it can happen. I know recently in my own game, we had 3 people who were invisible out of 4. One was not invisible, and they wound up getting attacked the most. 2 of us had greater invisibility, a bard and a sorcerer, and then we also had a cleric who had a particular feature that didn't give them greater invisibility, but just standard invisibility, and that changes everything. Then your dungeon master brings in their monsters, and they're also got greater invisibility or invisibility, and so tracking all of that can get very confusing at times. So just bear in mind when you start pulling this out that when you start using invisibility in your game, you do extend the amount of time it takes to actually figure out all that sort of stuff in your game. And that's just a product of, who can see whom, and trying to determine the best way of positioning people without people deliberately metagaming. That tends to happen. Okay, I want to talk about evasion. I'm talking about the rogue and the monk. It makes it possible, literally, to dodge 9 red dragons' fire breath for many rounds. This actually happened in one of my games. I had a player who was playing a high-level monk. He's about level 14, 15, and he said to me, well, right in the middle of this big epic battle between the Cult of the Dragon, their army, and we're also dealing with sort of the Sword Coast Alliance, and he said, I know there's dragons in the field. I am going to walk out into no man's land and challenge them all by my lonesome. He spent 3 rounds as I had 9 red dragons breathe on him, and evasion saved him from taking absolutely no damage whatsoever. Now, I'm sure that that's not always going to be the case when you're playing the game, but it is possible. And in fact, when that character did finally go down, it was not the dragon breath. Normally I would recommend using the dragon breath. It was not the dragon breath that took down the monk. Those 9 dragons, and I believe they were adult red dragons, essentially he was just too hard to deal with. I used the bite and the claws. I could not lift him off the ground and drop him because you can only do a maximum of 20d6 worth of damage. You can only take them up to about 200 feet, and going any higher, they reach terminal velocity. So unless the dungeon master starts house ruling things, you can only do so much damage. And of course, with a monk, they have this special feature that means they can take less damage when they fall. And he was playing like level 14 or 15, I think it was roughly around there. So I'd already figured out, and he hadn't multi-classed at all, he'd already figured out that I couldn't pick him up and drop him and kill him that way. So essentially, yes, he was able to survive dragon breath without too much trouble. And 9 adult red dragons is like crazy stuff, right? But some fun and humorous things that can take place. Okay, this is where your attack modifiers will often get so high that you can only miss when you roll a 20-sided dice if you roll a 2 and a 1. I've seen this happen quite often. Where even with like a usually armor class sits in the range of about 14 through to 18, but it's possible if the players sort of maximize their ability score and of course their modifier plus proficiency on top of that, and if they have magic items as well that allow them a bonus to their attack as well, you're starting to look at situations where they can't miss unless that 20-sided dice rolls up a 2 or a 1, which is just crazy stuff, but it does happen, which means the likelihood is that you'll always hit. Then there's the combinations of feats. Feats are one of those things in the game that are really powerful, and I know a lot of people who will not worry about bumping up their ability score and therefore their modifier, and instead they rely on feats such as the Polearm Master, Sentinel, Lucky. There are a lot of other, and it's not just those feats, it's the combination of them And you'll obviously, there's lots of different combinations. So I don't want to talk about all of them. I just wanted to talk about one in particular that I've seen used many times. And Polearm, Master, Sentinel, and Lucky are often the ones that I see at the table the most. But if you use your head and you think about how they fit together, there are a lot of different combinations that can make things quite interesting in terms of the outcome of the game. It allows you to change the probability of your game significantly by playing around with feats. You're going to be able to open doors to other worlds with just a spell. The gate spell, I remember, even though I didn't necessarily at times have my adventure running from one world to another, players could decide, well, no, I want to travel from here to another world, and I'm going to use the gate spell to do that. And so that means the Dungeon Master, you are able to actually force the game in a direction that the Dungeon Master may not be prepared for. So you might need to give them a little bit of leeway when you start doing this, because now it's like the world is your oyster. The universe is your oyster. You can go anywhere. And the gate spell is a really good example of that. And it doesn't, we're really looking at about, I wouldn't say it's epic level. You don't have to get to level 20 to get access to gate, but it'll be close to. Okay, and another one that crops up, and I think I briefly talked about it already, and that is being able to change or stop the flow of time itself. So whether you use something like Wish to travel back in time or change time in some way, there's also a spell called Time Stop, which essentially is more useful in combat and doesn't last a particularly long time, but it does allow you to do quite a lot, particularly if things get awkward. So if you need to escape, which you probably won't need to, but if you're dealing with a big bad and you want to deal with them quickly, Time Stop can change the aspect of your combat significantly. And I've heard of people using Time Stop out of sight of combat to do other things with the Dungeon Master's sort of veto, whether they decided that was appropriate for that situation. So be creative. There are ways of making it happen. You are now probably going to find that there are things such as meteorite swarms. So there's a meteorite swarm spell. So you can create a meteorite swarm. And essentially this is a huge area, multiple areas actually, and they're going to cause like 20d6 worth of damage. But here's the real amusing aspect, because I used to use this spell against the players' characters quite often, particularly at high level, because I ran from level 1 right through to level 20. And it is possible for almost all characters of any class at a high enough level to survive a meteorite swarm. You position it, you don't usually position them on top of each other. That's sort of a bit weird. You're supposed to sort of scatter them around. But it is possible for characters to still be standing after you drop one of these things. That's 20d6 worth of damage. High level characters can have anywhere from 200 to 250 hit points. Even a wizard is looking at the high numbers. They might go down, but often they still won't be killed outright. As I said, high level play, it's very hard to actually be instantly killed. So yes, you are going to be it's going to be possible to survive one of those spells. Okay, this is where magic items might very well be dripping from your limbs and body. And what you'll notice as you're playing the game is if you took all those magic items off, you'd still be perfectly fine, and you don't really need them. They're nice, but in a pinch, you can do without them, just because your character is so powerful. And I remember players mentioning to me on many occasions how it was like, I wanted this cool magic item, but I'm already so powerful, I don't really need that magic item. I could survive without that. I can achieve the goal without even using that. I've got spells and class features that are, better than my magic items in some aspects, and that's actually quite interesting. That means that if you have a dungeon master who doesn't like to give out a lot of magic items, you don't really have to worry about that, because you will find that your character is quite capable of managing without them. Okay, so all of this sounds absolutely great as a player, doesn't it? It sounds pretty cool, and it's really exciting, and it's exciting to think about working towards level 20. But here's the thing I want to just point out to you, and it's a sad fact, but it's true, and that is, unfortunately, it makes the Dungeon Master's task or job very hard, and they will tend to avoid high-level play or campaigns or adventures. And generally the reason behind that is combat is the biggest issue for them. They just can't figure out how to make combat interesting and exciting without it becoming like a 2 or 3 hour dice rolling exercise where all of the sort of storytelling elements just don't feel quite the same. And I'm sure there are ways of making a long combat more exciting by using descriptions and narration and so forth, but nobody really signed up to really play one single combat for an hour or 2 hours or even 3 hours. And this is the sort of thing that can happen at high level. So if you don't mind that sort of thing, great. But the problem is you'll find a lot of Dungeon Masters just can't stand it. There's so much for them to track and manage that they will just despise the whole idea of trying to run a high level game. So I want you to be understanding to your Dungeon Master who is trying to avoid running high level adventures, because that's often why they will do that. And there's another aspect to that as well, and you might not be aware of it, but when it comes to high level play, a lot of the advice that Dungeon Masters will get is to run less combat. Essentially, run less combat, make your life easier, and do things like focus on exploration, set the players' characters a goal they have to achieve that's not combat focused. It might be the social aspects of the game. Negotiation often comes up as a big part of the game as well. So those things tend to become more important. And of course, all of your character advancement, almost all of it, has been focused on just getting more powerful in combat. And therefore, suddenly you get higher in level, and yet you don't get to actually engage in high level battles and combat. And that's sort of really weird, right? It doesn't make an awful lot of sense, because you're dealing with a Dungeon Master who doesn't really see the point, because you've got access to raise dead, reincarnate, revivify, healing word. All of these things make it very difficult for your character to die. You can also get, later on, you're going to get true resurrection. So it doesn't even matter if you don't have the entire body, if it's not complete, Reincarnate, we used to use reincarnate to bring a character back when we only had a part of them left, and we didn't have the entire body because the heart was torn out or the head came off or something like that. So this is one of those things where it's really weird that your progression as a character is very much combat focused, and yet your Dungeon Master is more than likely going to be focusing on something other than combat. And I know that's a hard thing to understand. So this is often why when you're playing with a Dungeon Master and they say, look, I'm only going to run games from level 1 to level 10 or level 1 to 15. I'm not going past that. I don't really want to go up into I don't want to go to level 20. It's just too hard. I totally understand that. It makes a lot of sense for them, even if it doesn't make a lot of sense to you as a player. I know that my players at my table who were playing from level 15 to 20 had a ball. They loved it. But it's still difficult to do. That's the only hassle. So I'm hoping you found this video helpful, informative, or useful in some way, and if you did, fantastic. I actually have hundreds of videos for players and Dungeon Masters giving you advice on various aspects of the Dungeons & Dragons game, mostly around Dungeons & Dragons 5e, but I have a guide on how to use adventuring gear, basic tactics, how to use some of the different class features, the basic core mechanics, things like that. And you're welcome to go and check that out. And there's a whole lot of other advice for Dungeon Masters on pretty much every aspect of the game at this point. Now, if you want to support my channel so I keep doing videos like this, I have a Patreon page where you get access to the unlisted live streams, additional content which I put out from time to time, and also you get priority on the videos that I make. And that's really helpful, particularly if you can't find what you're looking for on YouTube. I also have affiliate links to the book depository and Amazon where you can buy stuff online. I get a small commission. I have a merchandise shelf underneath all of my videos if you want some swag. Make sure to share, like, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to be notified when I go live and when I publish new videos. And hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.